Hi, welcome to our last session of panel session for our symposium here at WashU, Decoys and Depictions. I'm welcoming Buzz Spector, Professor Emeritus of Art in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. He'll be moderating our last panel, Image Accumulations.
The difference between being a professor and a professor emeritus is you keep your WashU email and you lose access to IT. Our panel's title is Image Accumulations. Accumulation rules the present. Repositories of artifacts, documents, images, and data are incomprehensible in scale and expanding at inconceivable rates. These accumulations are surpluses of attention, of capital, of information, of energy and matter. At the same time, production and consumption, and in particular for our purposes, visual consumption, has accelerated. David Jozelet writes about this in his essay, Marking, Scoring, Storing, and Speculating on Time. This has provoked new ways of looking, and as an aside, also new ways of browsing. Looking through digital devices in order to collect and store images for later viewing. In this context, each digital device is a perpetually growing reserve of deferred knowledge, wherein memory relies on access to storage rather than mental retention. Again, as an aside, I'd like to indicate that the archive is a special case in relationship to what we're talking about today. I wrote about this now 20 years ago in commenting on the work of the artist Dieter Roth. And I'll read a quick paragraph from that as a marker for today's conversation. An archive is a repository of texts and or images organized around a given subject. The archive provides for a relation of general equivalence between its components and for a means of sorting through their accumulation. Unlike dictionaries or encyclopedias, which define words or ideas in relation to general, linguistic, and cultural models, and whose cognitive force is directed centrifugally toward the margins of a discursive terrain, the force of the archive is centripetal, drawing in traces of its concern that coalesce to form clearer, which is to say denser, more focused, insights into the meaning of its subject. The archive shares this inward focus with the diary, whose text is a reiteration of experiences directed toward the future self of the diarist. But diaries turn every experience into a personal one, a matter of effect rather than intention. And it is the intentionality of the archive, its emergence after the fact, that redeems it from diaristic narcissism. The role of the architect is defined by accumulation, gathering together various disciplines, organizing vast amounts of information, and enclosing worlds of multifarious things. However, as Sylvia Lavin points out in Architecture in Extremis, architects often ignore or dismiss the anti-spatial realm of storage and the data that underlies form and material. Our panel, Image Accumulations, are an examination of the architectural effects of excess ranging from hoards, both H-O-A-R-D-S and H-O-R-D-E-S, of unlike things, to aggregations of similar things, to diffuse atmospheres of things, like those described by Andrew Holder in Notes on More. The panel confronts physical and virtual densities and quantities, scrutinizing the capability of architecture to confront a magnitude of information in the fusing of data and picture. This raises some crucial questions. What are the consequences of virtual and physical accumulations to the built environment? How might architects contend with increasing densities of information? How does memory as storage reshape how we think about history? So our first panelists will be Brennan Buck and David Freeland, followed by Sage Dawson, then Kelley, Van Dyke, Murphy, and concluding with Marcelo, Spina. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, concluding with Petra, Kempf, who I do not want to leave out. So let's begin.
Great. Thank you, Buzz. Thank you, Constance. So Dave and I have a building practice. We'll talk about how we think about images in our work, which is, we try to pull into the building practice, I would say. We'll talk about that peripherally, though, more than directly. So let me, 218, okay. So let me talk about images in terms of illusion, and I want to talk about illusions, architectural illusions like this one by Andrea Pozzo in Rome, done in the 17th century, in terms of contemporary image culture, because we try to, we think they are relevant in a certain way. So Hito Steyrl in her her essay, The Poor Image, 10 years ago now, defined the poor image as a copy in motion. And circulation, for her, she argued, blurs the distinction between authorship and audience, or author and audience. So it's so easy to repost and manipulate images as they circulate that the audience is directly engaged in producing them at the cost of acknowledging their original authorship. So we think illusion offers a different form of engagement to an audience and shared authorship because they're inherently spatial. They depend on the viewer's position in space, and therefore the viewer is able to manipulate them and produce them in a certain way. So if we go back to Pozzo's diagram here in his treatise, he is constructing the picture plane as a grid at the base of the vault. And then he's introducing a point below it in space, which is the kind of third point in the perspectival construction. So you have the vanishing point. The vanishing point implies a point of view, which is still in the space of the painting. But then this third point, the station point, is out in three-dimensional space in the room. And in fact, there's often a disc on the floor that says "stand here." This is where you're intended to see the illusion. And so even in Pozzo's own time, his work was criticized for this reliance on the one point, because it functions ideally only from that one point. It was viewed as a sort of cheap trick, a little bit a one-liner, not art or architecture at its core. And so I think what is interesting for us about this is that if you think about it, so let me explain a little bit in terms of the image. On the left, you see this ceiling, false dome, painted on the ceiling of a church in Vienna by Pozzo, seen from the disc in the floor, seen from the station point where the illusion was projected, and you see the shape of the dome quite believably extends up from the barrel vaulted geometry of the ceiling. If you walk to the other end of the church and look back, you see what's on the right. So the dome is no longer vertical, it's no longer spherical, it is sort of rotated and distorted and stretched. And so that's what's interesting to us, that it's not so much that the illusion fails when you move off of that one point, it's that the illusion changes. The space of the illusion is malleable in that sense. And so we think of it as a form of poor image, a kind of image that can be engaged with and manipulated, not one that is robust and immersive like so many illusions that we see now, so many images, so many videos, films, virtual realities. Those are things that are completely immersive, but completely beyond the control of the viewer. So, in contrast, architectural illusion is sort of fragile. It's its space is ambiguous, and we view it as polycentric rather than limited to that one point of view. So, going to start on that? Yeah. So, we'll show 4 quick projects, all of which are based on perspectival projection, inspired in some way by Pozzo and other work of architectural illusion. This is a study model of a installation at the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian in Washington. It's a layer drawing that became a 2,500 square foot canopy in the ceiling of the space. So they had this is the Renwick Gallery. It's a fascinating 19th century building. It was the first purpose-built art museum in the US. It's also the first Second Empire-style building anywhere. And so, as a Victorian example of Victorian eclecticism, and given that we were limited to working in the ceiling of this gallery, we started to collect other Victorian-era ceilings from across the country, and that was what we started to draw. That was the content of our illusion. So we did these one-point perspective drawings of each of the ceilings and then started to tile them. And we looked at a way to produce the drawing at a much larger scale, using fabric, printed and cut fabric, and thought about how to design the line work so that it would be both, it would function representationally to just describe this other ceiling, but it would also function structurally to produce a taut surface as it's stretched on a frame. And you get several of those frames stacked on top of each other. They're all horizontal. There's a volume cut out of the lower frame, so you get both a graphic implied representational volume and a physical three-dimensional spatial voided volume. And then each of the 9 ceilings, that drawing is projected from a certain point in the gallery. As you wander through, you kind of encounter those points, and then this is the effect. There's lighting integrated into the layers of the ceiling. And Emmett was talking about Illustrator line work. There's a kind of physicalization of the Illustrator line, where the end of each line is produced as a kind of physical thing. So there's a real uncertainty to the materiality of the resulting canopy. And then here's on the left, you see from that projection point where all of those layers align into a single pattern. On the right, when you start to wander away from it, those layers separate and you get more of a cloud of line work.
Okay, so I'd like to talk now about a project that extends this idea of image and drawing into a built structure. This is a project we designed and fabricated for Mini as part of the recent series of Mini cabin installations at art fairs and design fairs in London, New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo, I think in Shanghai as well. These buildings are half micro-dwelling, prototype, and half event space, really meant to build the identity of their brand, this new mini living company that is being established, with an ambition to produce these new micro living dwellings. The direct prompt was to design a space to connect 2 standard modules that were provided by Mini, and that's what you can kind of see on either side here, the white volumes. Our interest was to take the cube of space that we were given in between and amplify that volumetric presence through multiplying it both in real space and in the space of the image. This began with a literal multiplication of the volume at different scales and orientations. The volumes are suggested by framework, 3 in total, which allude to the studs and joists of typical wall and ceiling framing. The walls are then clad in 1/4-inch polycarbonate, which is printed with a set of images, which ends up being translucent and folds between these different cubes. Printed on the polycarbonate is the image of the cube frame projected back onto itself. The rotation of the image creates the fourth and most dynamic of the cubes, which hovers within that space between the two chunks that were created by Mini. Projected perspectively, the image snaps into clarity at the entry from the elevator to this rooftop installation, this is in downtown Los Angeles at the Row. So to enter it, you kind of come up through the elevator, and this is the initial view. The cube image, though, quickly unfolds, overriding the reading of real studs to suggest a cube unhinged and floating between the space of the image and the cabin. The image of the cube really only works in 3D, though. As soon as it's unrolled, it's kind of impossible to flatten. It produces less likeliness to the cube as an overall volume, and more a kind of attention to its individual lines and parts, kind of advancing this more as a kind of drawing or image as opposed to volume. Flattening of the image produces new spatial implications. The frame is not just an index of the relationship between image and volume, it draws out a new set of spaces. On the interior, there's a collapse of the physical framework and image, complicated by real effects related to light, reflection, and material. The frame is both a measure of these effects and then also the substance of them. Another interior view where you can see some of these kind of partially interior, exterior conditions. The tectonics of the image was one of the most interesting parts of the research that went into the project. So this is one of our construction drawings, which is really more about assembly, and not just assembly of parts, but assembly of images. Each of the panels had 4 separate image files associated with them. One was the kind of opaque background material, which was laid down on top of the 1/4-inch polycarbonate. So that was a kind of a white, depicted here as black, but that was a white paint almost that went down on top. And then on top of that, we could then print color. There was the same process on the backside of those panels, and then an additional image, which was actually, it was a vector image, it was a PDF file. All these were PDF files that was then used to cut the pieces. So this was the kind of the coordination of all those files together into a single sort of cohesive description, which then also the contractor, we were working closely with the contractor throughout, but the person who was actually assembling it used this as a way to align the images. The legibility of the images produced the assembly as opposed to a kind of complex nomenclature system. And view back to the opposite side of the cabin.
So to the objects that are in the exhibition, they are based on a house that we finished about 1.5 years ago. I think at one time we thought it would be done in 2015, but it was not done for several more years. It's a set of faceted interlocking volumes, and so when we had photographs taken of the house, and I think that in thinking further about the perspectival projection and the spatial effects of that, we were thinking about how to manipulate the surface that is projected onto in a more, to have more control over that, to get that to produce a greater variety of spatial effects. So what we did was made these objects, which there are 3 objects and 3 parallel digital animations, and the objects are created from the geometry of the image itself. So we took the image, we projected it from a certain point onto these objects, manipulated the objects so that their geometry aligned to the edges and folds and faces of the objects aligned to the projected geometry of the image, and therefore produced a set of, this is the second one, a set of variations on the space of the house. So instead of, where you start is the flat photograph of the house, but as you rotate around, you get a whole series of mirrored, stretched, transformed versions of that space.
And I mean, one thing that was really important to the formulation of the house was this kind of blurring of interior and exterior, which we took in terms of the sort of the spatial configuration. There's a courtyard right at the center. The photographs are all of the interior. The act of developing these objects, though, produced a weird kind of exterior at the same time, which is maybe a way of reflecting on this through the image in a new way for us.
Yeah, so here rather than simply taking the picture plane and warping it as with a vault or layering it as with the Renwick Gallery show, we are turning it into a in the round object. And so I think some of the more interesting views of this are the sides, where they're the most different from the actual space of the house. And I think one other thing that we're interested in with these is the kind of convex-concave effect of understanding it sometimes as a convex object, but other times as the concave space of the house, which is depicted in the image. An unfolded version of all of the faces of that last object.
So the last project we wanted to share is one that we've just finished installing. We just have some photos of this. They're not final photos. This is an installation in Palo Alto commissioned by the city of Palo Alto called Cash Me If You Can. And it's installed at this, in front of the City Hall building, which consists of a 10-story office tower surrounded by a parking plaza designed by Edward Durrell Stone and completed in 1967. And our site for the installation is just behind those flagpoles, though noting that the perimeter colonnade has since been demolished. This is a postcard image from that time. The pavilion is a three-dimensional materialized image documenting the life of King Plaza, that's the name of the plaza out in front of the City Hall there, over the course of one day. Approaching from the front on axis with City Hall, the printed pattern aligns with its surroundings. The building's fenestration runs down across folded surfaces of the pavilion, and the plaza's gridded paving pattern extends up to meet it. From other angles, this view is stretched, folded, and mirrored, creating other less faithful views. These are the photographs from May 31st of this past spring, taken from that point of view right at the entry to the plaza. Geometrically, the structure is made up of 10 identical triangular panels. Each panel is printed with a projected pattern derived from the photographs of the site. Moving around the structure and then inside, the 20 printed surfaces chart the course of one day, describing the activity that took place, the changing light levels and shifting shadow patterns. It's a better description of the site, and then the object from more conventional orthogonal views. So the blue square there is the profile of the installation out in front of City Hall, which is kind of to the left, and then the image as described in plan and in elevation. It's kind of closed, kind of forcing you to move around it on axis with City Hall, but open in the opposite direction, allowing this exploration of the interior and the exterior in kind of concert with the changing light and qualities, colors through the day. So the image itself is entirely reprocessed. This is partially out of interest, but also out of necessity, since we didn't get the name and approval of the parents of the child that was photographed. Actually, we didn't even take the photographs. One of our former employees that was living in the area took them for us. And so the image is reprocessed, rethinking the nature of the pixel, so as to produce this effect of kind of seeming legibility, but as you move closer to the pavilion, that legibility breaks down in a kind of new image tectonic detail, a detail which also creates perforation and creates a kind of relationship between the image and the qualities of light that are filtered through these printed surfaces. So these are kind of several other views. As you move around it at different times of day, there's really kind of striking resonance with background, but at other times it advances a very different image of the plaza. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sage Dawson, and thanks to Constance and Carmen and Buzz for your introduction. I am a printmaker, so my approach to thinking about accumulation is really from that perspective. For me, printmaking is about the accumulation of marks and storing marks, and lends itself to the democratic potential through its repeatability. It is the multiple in the matrix, or the printing block, that I see connecting to the multiple around me in the city. So when I'm looking at cast iron columns or bricks or glazed tile in the city, I, as a printmaker, am always connecting those to the repeatability of printmaking. I ask myself, how might a printmaking mark begin to mark the flow of time, capture our history, record our lives? These are the questions I consider at the confluence of printmaking and the built environment. And then a second component to my work would be accumulation in terms of considering the repeatability and patterning that is loosely tied to the pattern and decoration movement of the 1970s and 80s. This movement really centered on marginalized art forms, from women's work and feminine art to non-Western art. Printmaking has always straddled the line between fine art and commercial, and this intersection is particularly interesting to me. Beyond the 70s and 80s, there is still much, I think, to expand on and explore in respect to pattern and decoration, especially in this Me Too era and this political moment when so many communities continue to be marginalized and respond by marching and protesting for equality. So I begin with a project called Brick Myth that was centered around looking at the National Building Arts Center in Sauget, Illinois, which is a repository for over 400,000 objects, mainly historic objects from the region. Many of these objects were harvested from buildings that were demolished in St. Louis beginning around the 1970s. And Larry Giles, who runs the repository, was basically going to sites and harvesting anything of historic value with the intent that this repository would one day be a museum. And so my project began by doing really sort of field research, going to the site and beginning to look at their collections and photographing those objects. And but in the back of my mind was a real interest in looking at the ornamental brick that was on site. All of it is crated. And I think he's got about over 40,000 different ornamental bricks in the collection. So this project is inspired not only by the brick that I was looking at the repository, but also by Persian pleasure pavilions. They're ornate paneled tents pitched outdoors for entertaining and gathering. The tent that I would eventually create utilizes ornamental brick patterns based on the 19th century brick I was studying at the National Building Arts Center. So it was a bit of a coincidence, but about the same time that I was at the repository, the St. Louis Art Museum was also putting together an exhibition called The Carpet and the Connoisseur. This was a few years ago. And it was a private collection of carpets, and the collector had gotten the museum to agree to also show his 2 tents in the collection. And I've been told by the curator that they were sort of hesitant to show the tents. But I think they were actually the highlight of the exhibition. So this is one, here we're looking at the interior. And the second of 2 tents in the show. At the same time, I was also visiting the St. Louis Art Museum's study room and looking at Persian miniatures, which have, a number of them have these sort of pleasure pavilions within the miniatures, and they show scenes of families gathering together and sitting under the tents and enjoying the afternoon or evening. So, like the rich sunshades, awnings, and fabric pavilions found in Persian miniatures, brick myths, fabric architecture is delicate. So here's I thought it might be fun to show you kind of the process of making the work. So here's the preliminary thumbnail sketch for the tent that I wanted to make. And then the sketches for each of the panels that would be block printed. So I was working from the photographs I had taken on site at the National Building Arts Center and putting together these sketches, as well as looking at the Persian miniatures and the tents at the Carpet and Connoisseur exhibition as reference. And then I started dyeing fabric, pulling prints, testing colors, then carving the printing blocks. So here are the printing blocks rolled up with a little bit of ink ahead of printing. And then the final piece. So what I had in mind was creating a tent, but also having a component to the work where the tent would be pitched in an empty lot in Tower Grove East, and then there would be a sort of evening event where people could come and lounge in the tent. And I partnered with a local supper club that created brick-themed food for the event. So we were lounging in the tent and also eating a lot of very red things. So ornamental bricks stack up the rust-like structure, and when you're inside the tent, they hover over the viewer as they recline. And the back of the tent is without a panel, with the intent of it being pitched against St. Louis brick building, so that standing architecture could really complete the piece. Piling, this is the piece at the exhibition at Desley, is a piece that also was really inspired by my time at the National Building Arts Center. So by the late 19th century, St. Louis had also become a center of cast iron production, with numerous foundries based within the city that produced architectural cast iron storefronts and columns. So, a lot of people are familiar with St. Louis having been the epicenter of brick production, but it was also an important place for cast iron production. Today, there are many examples of these cast iron pieces within the National Building Arts Center's collection, some of which are laying in open fields on site. Site visits to the repository were completed in order to view, photograph, and draw these cast iron remnants, followed by dyeing fabric, hand carving relief block plates, and printing a total of 18 columns onto fabric. The printing blocks themselves slowly broke down over the process of printing, resulting in unpredictable variations and ghostly impressions from column to column. This slow disappearance of the matrix parallels the erasure of structures from St. Louis's material culture, namely the cast iron storefronts cleared on the historic riverfront to make way for the arch. And today you can find, it's the only known cast iron storefront that I'm aware of, but you can find a cast iron storefront from the arch grounds that's at the new Arch Museum, and that's courtesy of the National Building Arts Center. Piling raises a complicated view of the American city that addresses structure and collapse, labor often unseen and forgotten, and utilizes, again, the democratic potential of printmaking to build a singular column from an accumulation of multiples. The piece hints at the interpretation and reinterpretation of ornamental imagery and its influence on our lives, especially those of us based in St. Louis. With several hundred buildings demolished each year in St. Louis, this pattern of erasure robustly continues today, and dwelling rights are inherently tied therein. The last project I want to show you is called Common Shift, and it engages a complex history of domestic labor, suffrage protests, architectural erasure again, and the undulating developments of the Enos Park neighborhood in Springfield, Illinois over the past century. Common Shift brings together historical needlepoint techniques, particularly those like open work, which were most common in times of economic hardship. This is a needlepoint technique where it was completely subtractive. So it was utilized quite a bit during the Great Depression. And it's something I'm familiar with because I have family members that worked with this technique. But basically it involves taking apart threads, taking apart the weave of, say, a pillowcase, and then utilizing those threads to come back in and work additively. So very economical. So I began the project, essentially this project was for the Terrain Biennial in Enos Park a couple years ago, and the Terrain Biennial is based out of Oak Park, Illinois, And artists are asked to partner with a homeowner and to create work for either the facade, the yard, or the porch of their home. And so there are a lot of these satellite terrain biennials that happen across the world, and one was taking place in Springfield, Illinois. So I began my project by visiting the site and beginning to photograph the neighborhood where the biennial would be taking place and looking at the housing stock there. And of interest was the way in which this historic neighborhood has this, this sort of combination of some of the original historic architecture with siding added. In fact, the local historical society, they're very preservationist minded, and they're really interested in removing all the siding. Sort of like they're very maybe hyper focused on siding and the removal of it. But what I found was just that it was interesting to see these two things side by side. And there are examples of homes without siding that are a little bit more maybe intact, arguably, but more examples of the siding juxtaposed next to the historic architecture. This is the neighborhood where Abraham Lincoln courted Mary Todd. There's a beautiful house in this neighborhood where he actually was courting her. So a lot of rich history here. So alongside the site visit, I also was working with the Missouri History Museum to look at examples of 19th and 20th century needlepoint and examples of women's work that would have been true to the Springfield, Illinois sort of region. And they also have on site as far as they were aware of, the only suffragette banner that is in St. Louis. Here it is. I was really intrigued by the text and, of course, their use of the Show Me State slogan within their banner. So what resulted in the end was selecting a house that was completely covered in siding. You can see the house to the right, on the right side, has a little bit more its historic components intact. And in the middle, the house that I worked with is completely covered in siding. So the piece brings together historic needle point techniques, like the open work technique I was mentioning. Many of the images that I was looking at the Missouri History Museum's archive. But it also brings together architectural patterning from the surrounding neighborhood, as well as color and material references drawn from suffragette protest banners for a site-sensitive installation comprised of canvas, holographs, hand-stitching, brooms, and banners. I'd like to end with curatorial text from the curator of Common Shift, James McAnally. The blue bordering violet does not match the color of the morning, but the suffrage of the evening. A blue of waiting, of change. Color standing in for a series of petitions. It is stitched from history and open work with threads stretched apart. We enter the past through needle points, puncturing the present as we meet a common ancestor. A feminine question, open-ended, that asks whether we or our labor are ever held in common. Where we wonder whatever even makes a community communal. We use the materials available, we open them in order to see through. When you cut into the present, the future leaks out, said one neighbor. It is intricate work, history. Shifts bend in the breeze, we sweep the threads up, though after enough wind, even bricks bend and scatter. This is simply the terrain we are in, where we are always also a they, and they rise and fall together. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Constance, for this amazing weekend and event, and also for really trusting me to design and fabricate and now talk about something that you've never seen before a few weeks ago. It's really interesting following Paige. I think, Sage, I'm sorry, I think you actually have a similar image here. I am mostly going to be talking about a new research project that is inspired by the beautiful ceramic and pressed brickwork that makes up so much of St. Louis's rich material and architectural history. Historically, clay building components were valued for their strength, modularity, fire resistance, environmental factors, and aesthetics. In St. Louis, clay has a greater significance to our built environment. At the turn of the century, the hydraulic press brick company was producing 100 million bricks per year by 1900. And the abundance of clay and the affordability of bricks contributed to the longevity of building stock where even modest homes had ornamental bricks, corbelling, recesses, and extensions. St. Louis is home to Adler and Sullivan's Wainwright Building, the Union Trust Building, among others, which I'll be talking about a little bit more later. And also even this really interesting collection of ornaments, mostly by Sullivan at the City Museum. In my research, I was particularly drawn to the drawings in Sullivan's A System of Architectural Ornament. His final statement about the geometry underlying both natural and man-made forms, evolving from closed geometric units to open efflorescent form. In my new research project explores this role of emerging digital technologies with an understanding of the ways humans have been constructing buildings for millennia. This work replaces the unsustainable fixed plastic materials with which 3D printing is typically done with clay, a malleable, a sustainable, locally sourced, and reusable medium with deep roots in St. Louis's rich architectural history. In FDM printing, or extrusion brace printing, 3D printed objects are defined by the layers of plastic that are created as the object is printed, resulting in an evenly striated, textured surface. For ceramics, surface qualities are more difficult to predict due to the malleable nature of clay. The expressive potential for the forms created through the 3D printing are defined by gravity, machine behavior, and the consistency of the clay mixture itself. And you guys have probably seen my little research assistants hopping in the background. This is the project that I created for the Desley. It's a totem with 18 different cylindrical stacked units, all based on the same root geometry with very slight variations. This image shows the roots of the geometry, basically these two curves here, or two horizontal sections, and the variation is created through the lofting of these sections and sort of the change in directionality of that loft. This is an image of all 18 cylinders in the gallery, or that were used in the gallery, and then an image of them printed. After building the digital model, and then the the G code is created, which is the directions for how the printer translates the model file. In the G code, you set the extrusion speed, as well as the movement of the bed, for which ceramics is specific to each different clay body. For example, the G code or directions for stoneware, which is used in this piece, is different from porcelain, which is different from terracotta. After printing, the units are air dried for about a week, and then spend 3 days in the kiln, and if they're glazed, 3 more days after that. And here you can see a side-by-side image of the digital model and the final printed unit. For me, this project was really about learning about this relationship between the modeling software, the software that generates the code, the material, the clay body itself, and the printer. And then here's a detailed image of the final assembled piece. Current computational work in architecture has fixated on the novelty of digital technology through rapid prototyping and parametricism. This project attempts to engage the immediacy of the digital with the ancient history of clay. As a generative technique, 3D printing exposes both process and medium. The grain of the printing and the application of the substrate produce a textural quality that has potential for enhancement. With ceramics, this discrepancy between the idealized intended outcome and actualized product is even greater. While the textural impression of the traditional 3D printed media is a given, in ceramics, the difference between what is intended and what comes out of the machine has the ability to become a design parameter in itself. The irregularities and deformation of the clay has expressive potential which could yield a material aesthetic unique to the material process. This next project is a proposal for a screen wall located at Hotel St. Louis, which is the former Union Trust building by Louis Sullivan. And it's very exciting because I found out about a week ago that I was one of 4 chosen to build this proposal this spring. The project really began as a call for a large-scale public artwork in downtown St. Louis and really began with the selection of a site. I was really interested in looking at Sullivan's buildings, both the Wainwright and Union Trust, and specifically the ornamentation on those buildings. It's kind of funny how I ended up at the site. Upon visiting downtown, Hotel St. Louis, which just finished renovation, had in their parking lot, they had this large piece of mechanical equipment. And we approached the architect about creating a screen, and they were really excited about the idea. And the concrete is already reinforced for a larger structure there, so it really was a perfect place for this project. Let's see. So I said earlier, I was really inspired by, particularly by the geometry and the patterns in the ornament at the cornice of the Union Trust building. We began by really just sort of tracing the geometries found at this location. And here you can see sort of a derivation of the geometries that we're looking at. This informs the design of our module or unit that we worked with, sort of almost like these sort of sine curves that you see here. And then here is an image of the final component. Right now, we're sort of in the process of building sort of the infill or cellular pieces of this brick, where we will add mortar, and then also beginning to look into glazing studies for some of the different brick components. We called the project Sign Screen because these were the sort of the underlying geometries that we found in Sullivan's ornaments. It informed both the brick or the unit, and then also sort of the larger patterning in the screen, and even structurally how we began to start to look at how we could create this screen and think about this as using the compressive strength of the units, and also create something that was somewhat spatial, but still a screen or a wall. And here you can see a final image of, at least right now, where we are with the project. Let's see. Okay, so I'm showing this project, the Double L House, which was designed while working with Urban Improvement Company here in St. Louis, because it was really where I fell in love with working with brick. I sort of looked at it as a beginning of a full-scale investigation in aggregation strategies for architectural building components. Both brick and shingles were used in atypical ways to produce textural effects and patterns on the exterior of the house. The house is in the Botanical Heights neighborhood of St. Louis, which is somewhat similar to the first image I opened with. And this drawing here kind of shows like the variation of the roof lines that you see in this neighborhood, which is typical of St. Louis City. And there's really kind of a mix of architectural styles, where there starts to be this really interesting sort of rhythm set up by these roof lines. And the form of the house really kind of came from looking at all of these different types of houses, really kind of focusing on the flounder style that's really seen in that neighborhood. The name Double L takes the house takes its name from its configuration both in plan and section, the L. In order to take full advantage of the site condition, the house is organized in an L-shaped plan with a master suite in the one-story volume and the rest of the house in the two-story portion. An open stair runs perpendicular to the plan, dividing along the dining and living rooms, utilizing the width of the site. And the L plan allows for a private courtyard in back and a private entrance from the garage. This was also the last corner lot left in that neighborhood. We used an asymmetrically loaded scissor truss to create the skewed shape of the roof, again based on this sort of traditional flounder style roof. A dormer pops out of the roof, allowing light into the stair below, and a deck is inset in the roof volume to create a play between solid and void. Here we wrap the deck in roof shingles to really add to this feeling of inhabiting the roof. And this was an interesting moment in the project where we were working with the general contractor, and the roof guys were like, well, that's a wall, that's not our territory. And then the people, the brick masons said, well, that's a roof. That's not our territory either. So it's kind of a funny moment in the project. And here's just some construction photos showing the scissor trusses being set into place. And then a closer image showing this brick skin and some of the patterning and texture ideas that we were able to test out in the house. On the one-story volume, you see the little place where the two pieces meet and it sort of folds up. That was actually a roof deck that was added by the client later on, so we developed a way that we could still use this patterning of the brick that's seen on the facade and not have to create a railing or to be used as a railing there. And then here you see this sort of colliding between the two volumes in the slot when you enter the house. And then here, also at the entry, I was also again looking at this idea of sort of a screen and really thinking about the stair as a space of its own. And so we created a steel and wood screen here. So as you can see in the photo, it really, you sort of read this threshold space as a sort of space of its own here. The next project, Vale House, served as a speculative study in aggregation through parametric modeling unit, utilizing brick as a modulator of light. I was really interested in this idea of brick, or creating this idea of lightness with brick, sort of like a veil in this project. It is sited in Cherokee Street, which is made up of a similar neighborhood to the one I showed earlier, historical 2-story and 3-story brick houses, but also home to a lot of art galleries and restaurants. And this was a proposal for a live-work unit with a gallery below and living above, where the brickwork changes based on the program inside. Began by a series of sort of analog models thinking about these units, and then at the same time digitally modeling or parametrically modeling the sort of precise placement of these bricks within the project. And then also really thinking about how we can provide privacy while also moderating light and limiting views from the street to the living spaces above. And then here's a final view of the entry, where I created a sort of large tear-like opening, so that brick veil seems to pull away, revealing the entry and pulling the visitors to the center. And then I'm going to wrap up by showing some work for a seminar that I'm currently teaching. Expanding Skin is inspired by Annie Albert's text, The Pliable Plane, where she writes, if we think of clothing as a secondary skin, we might enlarge on this thought and realize that the enclosure of walls in a way is a third covering, that our habitation is another habit. I really see this course as a laboratory for developing new strategies for constructing complex surfaces at the scale of the human body. In Albert's text, she proposed the concept of skin as an inhabitable layer, first as a covering for the body, and then as an expanded layer of enclosure. Emphasis is placed on assemblies that yield innovative visual or tactile effects, while also engaging specific material performance. How can we design with a focus on performative pattern that can enclose the body and its structural and geometric complexities? And how can we conceive of patterns that are not disrupted by these complexities, but rather enhanced by them? In this project, the first two projects, the students were working more with laser cutting and how they could take this sheet-like material and create cuts in a way to start to create a textile. And in Hayes' project, she even went on to what you could call sort of a third skin, and created something that you've seen as sort of a layer of the interior. This was the pattern that she looked at, and then sort of a final image showing how she layered the mylar and then was looking at how these patterns overlapped and how she included seaming to this project. This is another one by Rachel Reinhard, where she created this bodice and began with, creating a series of cuts and then looked at different types of patterning. She even looked at how historically dressmakers would make a pattern and actually found that worked in the total opposite direction of something that she wanted to really be flexible. And the final one shows the final iteration of the piece that you see her wearing. And then I'm going to show a few projects from the current iteration this semester. They just had the mid-review last week. This is a project by Gary Lee and Rubo Sun, and in this stage we're really focusing on 3D printing this semester, and so the students started with analog studies of tessellations in paper, and then translated that to a set of field variation drawings, and then from there digitally modeled, started to draw a unit, and the unit then became aggregated or interlocked. And so the top row is the field variation study, the second row are the units, and then the aggregation studies. And then here is an image of some of the pieces that they've prototyped, and then the final sort of textile pattern. For the rest of the semester, the students will be working together to create a textile or garment for the body. And then here's another project by a group of students with the field variation on top and the units below. Sorry, it's a little bit light. And this one, we're looking almost at a sort of chainmail as a precedent study, and then recreating that. And it's really interesting because the unit becomes really, really strong when it's in tension. And then finally, this third project where Kelley and Julie were using inspired by lace and thinking about how they could use this hard fixed material plastic and create something that looks like lace. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Constance, for having me here again, and it's good to see old friends and people I've seen, I've met before. In describing the sort of situation, the kind of cultural, political situation around what's going on today, which kind of begins obviously way outside of architecture. Googling like globalization and its discontents, and you find this image, which is I don't know. Oh, yes, okay, yeah, that was not the image I was talking about. But it's good propaganda for WashU, you know. Thank you, Brennan. You're welcome. So that was the image. It actually kind of shows well how the sort of power of the image to convey huge, vast process of change that basically address the kind of, where we're living today. No, I mean the sort of globalization and the image that sort of globalization casts on individual identity, and what that produces for architecture, and what sort of architecture has to do or is to do with that in relation to its own power, the possibility, the interest of architecture being or not an icon, and whether that is actually something that we should be pursuing or not today. So I think this is actually is quite demonstrative. Of course, architecture and its image, I think it's been clear with all the presentations so far that this is what we're here for, but it hasn't always been the case, architecture and image, at some point, at least at that time, they were seen as separated, like graphics and so on were over here, and architecture symbolizing tectonics, physicality, presence, space was someplace else. Clearly, this is no longer the case, and what we have today is something much more unified. Of course, what's at stake for me and for the work we do in the office, it's what are the kind of images that we're actually interested today, and what are the kind of images that architecture could sort of nurture itself from. And so these are, maybe this is a little bit of a strange image that I always get fascinated from ever since I saw this as a sort of opening series of True Detective, where kind of photo, like outline and content, or outline and context actually work together to produce a kind of really, not only a strange image, but what's most important is something that really has to do with the content that one is ultimately going to see. What's interesting here really has to do with the sort of problem of accumulation, of like what this sort of projection produces on character, produces on identity. And my sort of simple understanding of this is kind of related to the hyper-resembling cloud, with thanks to Jacques Rancière, I guess, where the sort of hyper-resemblance come from. Maybe this is not quite what he's talking about, but his text is a little bit too long for my patient, so I like to probably understand it in this particular way. There's always been this sort of relationship of the cloud, and when you were actually in 90s at Columbia, you will think like, don't think of the cloud as the kind of cloud that the kids will draw, think of the cloud as the way meteorologists will make the cloud as a bunch of points. Of course, it's much easier to draw the clouds that, kids will draw, but yet clouds are actually what the picture shows. So the kind of hyper cloud, it would be like, can you actually try and sort of put these things together and find objects, architecture that can move sort of in between that? I don't know if this is completely possible, but certainly we try to consider work that maybe moves in this direction by thinking of like what happens, and this is obviously Brennan and David touch upon this, and the idea of like self-projection, the idea of like hyper-resemblance are things that you have these sort of parallel beings of objects where the image of the object gets sort of recasted itself in a way that somehow, obliterates or moves or obfuscates the object and its reading. So, but also the sort of specificity of the image translated into a kind of rasterization, so it means that bits and dots that could potentially be taken into a whole other situation that might actually go into conditions of tectonics. These are a series of projects we did for Budapest, all museums in a single park. And these are all axonometric views showing the effects of this sort of simple process, where like the same procedure actually produces different effects according to whatever, a bunch of contingent conditions related to the work, no? But then how that actually could potentially become tectonic, this is a quick translation we did into an object. Not quick, actually it took quite a long time, but that's, that's just like an undermining of what it is. But in terms of how this could actually sort of engage material and engage tectonics, but also engage actual, and this is obviously the sort of duality of the images that we're actually like passionate about these things, passionate about photography as being probably what can allow the sort of hyper-resembling objects, or architecture to engage with the real, even when the real is still unattainable. These are projects that are never going to see the light of the day in terms of the reality of buildings, so they exist in kind of our imagination as images, and this is as close as they get. So, which brings me to another kind of aspect of accumulation, which is this idea of concentration, and this is important, not just for renderings, let's say, but how architecture can sort of concentrate attention in order to actually reveal also what Jacques Rancière talks about, the sort of alterity of the image, that what is actually suggests to sort of otherness, which is sort of certain mystery, which I will associate with this idea of a mute icon, this sort of paradox where the building has features that will resemble in itself as something that will want to be seen, and yet it also could has other features that will make it sort of withdraw from that, which normally would characterize as being iconic. Anyway, our interest in photography made us to actually experiment with this and hire a drone, which actually ended up being a small airplane that flew over Budapest Central Park and captured all these images, along with our collaborator Casey Ream on this, to actually create a sort of huge, almost like a pointillist montage, which attended to moments of photorealism and just moments of, sheer glitchiness in a way, mostly to reveal that in the sort of, that even in photography there's all these other hidden elements and layers that actually compose images that we tend to assume as sort of given these days. So anyway, Constance asked us to participate on this, and the two projects we submitted are actually not buildings. And I'd actually like to make a difference of that because it does really changes, and does matter. So one of them is an installation we did at Sonos Studio in Los Angeles. It's sort of interior environment which really deals with mostly this idea of decoy, the problem of projection over volumes that are meant to describe spaces, but they're the misalignment between what the projection that controlled by the architect in that case, and projection controlled by the media artist in this case, which completely throw the environment into disarray. The installation was slightly based on a sort of idea, Kafka, of metamorphosis, that the things that the sort of cast of shadows that one makes, it's completely different, It's like something actually changes into that. I mean, again, this is immersive. I don't think architecture can actually deliver something like this, but given music and sound and projection and a lot of image, this is actually changing over time. This is what happened in a way. But what's interesting in this particular case is how the sort of images of volumes got kind of recasted into things that were actually not necessarily solid volumes, but kind of empty shells, which completely contrasting surfaces inside. The theme was supposed to mean like moments of agitation in one of these, and serene. This was clad in an entire like white carpet, and with with a different sound and motion and so on. Doesn't really matter, but this was actually something that happened. This is probably a sort of simple project that we did, probably the simplest project. And I was thinking of a quote that I read yesterday from Tom York, saying that the best piece of music he likes to write is one that he doesn't recognize himself into it, and that's the kind of music he likes to do. Not so sure I really would like to agree with that completely, but the fact that I actually don't recognize ourselves so much on this, it's something interesting in a way. This brings the issue of authorship that was actually floating in the room, which I'm all in favor for. Not the disappearance of authorship, but the actually assertion and maybe the sort of stranging of authorship. It's for a traveling performance based on John Didion's White Album. This was done by Lars Jan, who's actually a director, performing arts, and who sort of bought the title, bought the rights, and made this sort of fantastic reinterpretation of this incredibly important text for the sort of the end of the 60s, especially of the history of Southern California, and how basically this sort of unfolding of events, which really probably resonates deeply on what's going on today, especially in America, relate to the kind of architecture that sort of exists as a kind of frame around it in a way. So what you see is a sort of constant projection of really the kind of visual narrative that Lars created for this, where the architecture really had to exist as a kind of as a sort of allusion to a Hollywood house that basically John Didion lives towards the end of the 60s. This is where, like, blocks away, the Manson murders took place, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting in how this, visual narrative, constantly, including the sort of markings in a way, back to the text that you were referring earlier, begins to sort of challenge and even kind of, grow beyond the actual frame of what's normally would consider architecture, to the sort of end where Mia ended up being actually at the top. So anyway, finally, just to end, an architectural project which is not yet built, hopefully will be soon, will start soon, that really deals with accumulation as a kind of unified incongruity, where images, or the sort of same source image, is casted on the building in different ways, leading to a kind of tectonics, but to a sort of tectonic of flatness that doesn't give away a lot, and actually tends to understand volume more as a sequence of surfaces rather than as actually a sort of three-dimensionality of volume. We use this, we call them Choisy views, they're basically warm side view to depict this sort of almost impossible corner where three volumes, actually a volume that's been cut out, and then progress cut out to actually into sort of three separate volumes that get sort of unified by a sort of consistent void, are put together into this sort of razor-thin edge, which I should have details for this. I do have them, but I'm not actually showing here. Where glass, sort of deep things that are vertical, and a stamped metal on the soffit coalesce together on a kind of on a sort of very, very, very thin edge. And the idea is that all of those things together somehow put something that exists as material, let's say, that goes from the sort of image back again into a kind of fluted glass, with a sort of pointillism that defines the change of from a shadow box to the areas of vision of an office building in Glendale, actually, which is one of the adjacent sort of municipalities of Los Angeles, to the vertical orientation of metal powder-coated things, which will actually, offer both depth and fuzziness on the other facade, to the much more kind of light and shiny, shimmering stamped metal panels that are actually located on the soffit of the building. This is the way it should look, but of course we're also kind of seeing back and forth, and this is also kind of important. I guess I decided not to show student work, but I guess all of these things actually move between back and forth between the sort of the kind of photographic image, and not that the rendering gets any closer to that, but we try to actually stay try to find some sort of fidelity between the image and the rendering image and the photography in terms of how material would actually behave. This is not the case of it, that's probably the case of it, but sort of going back and forth between more sort of disciplinary instantiations and what these things are actually probably meant to do in the real world, which is maybe like this, maybe not. But so to conclude, it's really about the sort of the possibility of this alterity of the image in architecture, in the real, what sort of interests me, and I think what's actually probably worth continue discussing. Thank you.
So, Constance, thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, when Constance first approached me about the symposium and its content, I have to admit, I was put on the spot. And particular to the work that I was doing at that moment and what I did when I was part of the paperless studio environment at Columbia Universities in the 90s. So we were the first guinea pigs of paperless studios, of the digital image, and we produced digital images of the built environment without an end. And the production was a seduction of images that was maybe naive, and it was also an amazing environment where we created things that maybe your generation now picked up and worked on with now. But anyway, so I wasn't sure what to do with that when you actually mentioned to me, hey, why don't you think about this urban project that you did, this urban mapping project? And this was a project I actually developed after I left Columbia and while I was working for the Department of City Planning in New York. So I looked at that mapping project and I looked at it again and I walked away and I couldn't figure it out what you actually saw in this. I couldn't figure it out. I was staring at it and I knew, okay, I made these drawings, but I couldn't, I don't know, so I was stuck. So I decided I had to figure out a way to look at this from a different point of view. And I want to actually thank you for that because it really pushed me really hard and I had a really hard time with it. But this is what I'm going to show you today. This is the fourth attempt of this, putting this presentation together. And this presentation will evolve around the notion of how urban dwellers make use of the digital image as well as how they engage with it. And related to that question is what kind of participants are we in this process of recording the urban construct while they are sharing the images of the urban on digital platforms. So recording cities is nothing new. Architects, urban designers, and planners have always been fascinated by finding new means to frame and record the urban construct. But not only designers are searching for new means to record the urban condition these days. There's a whole other force of participating entities out in the field that frame, collect, and circulate data of cities today. Enabled mostly by private corporations who provide digital platforms, such as apps, to post data on platforms to map the entire world, like Google Map, for example, who involves citizen cartographers in their project to document and catalog the urban construct. A semi-bottom-up, top-down approach where everyone seems to be able to participate, assuming one has, of course, access to a smartphone or a computer that abides, of course, to the rules that are set by a corporation. So as Google monitors every single move and edits the input of its citizen cartographers in case they're not compliant, with their standards. So Google made it possible that everyone technically could participate in recording and constructing the urban condition. Just a couple of keystrokes and you have contributed to and updated the collective map. And there are other platforms out there, like Yelp, Snapchat, or Instagram, for example, that provide us with platforms to frame, collect, and distribute our recordings of the urban condition, which many of us happily and with great joy use, and actually I'm totally included in this. So in this slide, I think it's safe to say a majority of city dwellers today navigate the city via their smartphone applications or via other devices such as computers or tablets. We have multiple platforms disposable at our fingertips through which we record and store our everyday urban life stories. Stories that are mostly captured these days in form of images, depicting urban scenes captured and packaged like a tableau vivant. A scene presented on a stage, motionless, orchestrated, and static. However, as city dwellers perceive and navigate through the city via their smartphone applications, they leave traces behind. Traces of data that in turn serve as an input to decisions of others. While we post happily images on Instagram, for example, private entities collect quietly behind the scene information about us. That could include our location, the comment we posted, and other viable data we so happily provide these days. One hashtag and the image we recorded joins a larger pool of recorded data, released into the World Wide Web to be directed to corporations and other information-savvy entities. We all have experienced this. That's what I'm gonna get for following Michael Allen. So we all have experienced it. We give a thumb up on a feed. Shortly after, an ad appears. An ad on our Instagram feed, and this is on mine, really shortly after, and I'm private with my Instagram feed, I'm not public, promoting an item that responds to my feed or to my liking, they think. I can't help but keep asking myself, what kind of participants or citizens are we in this process of recording the urban construct while sharing our images on these digital platforms these days? Do these platforms really empower us as citizens and citizen cartographers? And what kind of collective are we producing or contributing while we feed or record our stories on these digital-driven platforms? Cities are an everyday invention. They are an everyday invention that unfolds in multiple interactions, a process by which the subject is as much as embedded in the object as the object is embedded in the subject. Meaning, we are as much as embedded in the city as the city is embedded in us. It is from that vantage point that the constant becoming of the urban construct emerges and transforms. A spatial engagement through which we forever establish new positions, the possibility to record and construct situations of the urban condition. As these interactions unfold, we filter, we translate, and frame fragments of the city into mentally constructed snapshots through which we release or recreate different realities of the city. And yes, it is true, one could argue, any city dweller in this scenario with a mobile device seems to record and contribute fragments of the city into digital snapshots, to capture and then share images on a feed. However, while mobile technologies allow us to instantly and incessantly post images, let's say on Instagram, into an open-ended but linear timeline, it is, I think, critical to acknowledge that any feed in this scenario underlies a highly orchestrated process of selection, an inclusive item of exhibition that becomes in return a target for possible surveillance. A record ready to be capitalized by others. Filter after filter, image after image, we hand out decoys of life, chopped up by algorithms into digestible, marketable, and governable, and hackable categories. Meaning, the police, for example, collects different sets of data points of you and me than, let's say, your bank, Facebook, Google, or Instagram. As we engage in this rather manipulative, self-revolving algorithmic flirt, that displays, or maybe not, a remotely controlled as well as assembled reality of our everyday life stories. This played in form of a tableau vivant, a sanitized scene relentlessly aestheticized to the point that nothing appears as something merely ordinary or mundane, but static and carefully posed, generating an exclusive manipulative narrative controlled by various agencies. So as we feed these platforms, I believe we participate no longer in the capacity of urban citizens. Urban citizens that engage in constructing an emergent urban ground or common ground from which the everyday urban condition could unfold, without being traced, monitored, or captured by a remote operating entity. Instead, we have transformed into a different kind of species, a species that consists of a highly privatized and isolated force of affluent consumers. This is actually a student of mine. I asked him to pose what he thinks, what that kind of description of this new person would be, and that's what I got from him. Fooled into the idea of being part of an extended, larger society that is tightly connected to one another within this vast urban landscape via their devices. As we feed these ferocious platforms with images of the urban construct, we contribute to the construction of an exclusive archive, an archive that is remotely controlled to store certain narratives, just like the armaria, the enclosed cupboards of the ancient libraries, then celebrating the city through its fleeting moments that allow for the urban construct to evolve through all of its emergent stories. Cities are an everyday invention. They are untraceable and all-encompassing as they reveal themselves through fleeting spatial interactions to construct an endless field of emerging urban realities. Within these parameters, the recording of the urban condition resembles a sequence of fleeting spatial operations through which we all assemble a virtual depiction of the urban condition, forever changing without ever leaving a visible trace. Similar to the recording techniques conducted by the indigenous population of Australia, they as well create an intricate network of song itineraries in which each song line is attributed to a particular terrain that together form a complex network of symbolic pathways in which distinctive markers in the landscape construct the mental representation of a particular space. They convert every single moment of their journey into an absolute local zone, a form of recording in which self is as much as embedded in the other as the other is embedded in oneself, forever establishing new possibilities to perceive and construct a virtual recording of the urban construct. A notion that Gilles Deleuze and Faith Guattari perhaps explored in their essays of smooth and striated spaces. Engaged in smooth space is for them an infinite sequence of arising occurrences with various orientations, a form of locality that can be found in the endless succession of absolutely local and unpredictable events emerging. Events that create a difference in as much as they transmit and merge information that is of site-specific nature, or of a site-specific story, one could say. Together, these events then accumulate or form a complex patchwork of everyday life stories. It cannot be traced, cannot be monitored or controlled by others, like by an institution and governmental apparatus or an app. In this scenario, not a single story can be traced, and I think that is key. A notion that was also pursued by Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard differentiates between grand narratives and little narratives. Grand narratives equate to a chain of pre-structured principles. They are informed by the foundation of a given society or corporation. Principles that mainly operate within a system that controls and manages its citizens, applying the tools used to govern politics, a configuration determined by precise coordinates to exercise its managerial power. Whereas little narratives are political in character, as they're part of a constantly changing field of interaction that breaks with the credentials of the grand narratives because they consist of an intricate game of constantly changing situations assembled by the subject's everyday lives. Each of these little narratives subsiding through the crack of the grand narratives, they cannot be detected or monitored. as they form a cacophony of ever-emerging new stories, stories that ceaselessly open up the stage for transformations. Celebrate place while unfolding. As soon as the story surfaces, it disappears again without a trace. Always on the threshold and always new in becoming. However, in the light of Instagram and Google, for example, I would argue these little narratives now have transformed into an exclusive type of composed imagery that seem to have a strong resemblance to grand narratives. And yes, one could make the case the stories unfolding through the Instagram, or for example, the stories unfolding through Instagram, for example, could be considered as small narratives as they transmit and merge information from various sources. They also seem to form a complex patchwork of everyday life stories. The difference, however, is they are composed, they're static, they're exclusive, and can be traced as well as monitored by others. However, everyday stories of the urban construct, in my opinion, are not exclusive in character. They form an endless field of uncontrollable and ever-emerging new storylines. As stories unfold, an untraceable mesh of changing relations emerge. Emergent relations through which the urban dweller unfolds and folds different realities of the urban condition. By transitioning from one moment to another, a new position appears, both figuratively and literally. The urban construct is reconfigured. While space from the perspective of politics possesses a configuration determined by precise coordinates to exercise its power, the act of being political emerges out of a constantly changing field of interaction. As new urban relations of social interactions emerge, new places of public encounter are being configured. The collective may unfold. A collective that consists of a complex pattern of evolving implications and ever-evolving assemblage of untraceable stories, in which the individual and the collective are not understood as separate entities, but part of a relational assemblage. In this interplay of being singular plural, the urban collective is to be understood as an ever-evolving assemblage, cannot be traced, cannot be monitored or captured in an image. It is relational and therefore always fleeting. This point of view opens a different perspective from which the urban dweller may begin to redefine their relationship to the governing body, to one another, and to the environment we are part of, or maybe not part of. As we become directly engaged with the environment, we become actively engaged in its production. It becomes a constitutive part of our being. Space from this perspective is no longer considered a static construct wherein things unfold, but a perpetual generator for emerging configurations. From this point of view, the urban construct does not appear as an agglomeration of lifeless and disconnected parts that can be actually captured, but a ceaseless production of changing relations. By accepting our engagement with the environment as an untraceable yet localized phenomenon of changing situations, we may take again the role of political engaged agents that unfold these everyday stories between the managerial rituals of these corporations and governmental institutions. As we leave these hashtags behind and escape the coordinates, the vectors, and cookie-savvy corporations that record and manage our pixelated data. The recording of the city from that vantage point could be considered again a powerful source through which we may form a common ground where we are not disconnected, but are one with the environment as much as the environment is one with us. An engagement where our locality resonates with others into a common body. A common body also known as the collective. A collective that consists of a complex pattern of evolving implications and ever-evolving assemblage of untraceable stories. I myself am part of people, or you are the city. The title of a mapping project I assembled to record the constantly evolving urban construction, completely offline. Untraceable and always evolving. This mapping game allows for a different configuration to unfold through which the urban stories may emerge, without ever being traced or recorded by any institution or any governmental body. By overlaying these diagrams without assuming a specific hierarchy, order, or single organizing principle, new stories of the city appear. Stories that, not unlike the little narratives described by Lyotard, as they reveal themselves in between the overlays, and only between the overlays, the place of transit, the moment of transformation, where the storyteller becomes one with the city. Unlike the static composition of the tableau vivant, the composition of independently structured conditions like the layers represented in You Are the City results in a field of multiple outcomes. These accumulations, English second language, here we go, are not composed, they are not static, they are not exclusive, and cannot be traced as well as monitored by others. The act of recording in this regard is not anymore considered part of a closed system that accumulates, but a way to become a powerful source through which we may unfold emerging urban stories. Fluid stories and not static images that rise and disappear while we are being immersed in the urban landscape. An urban landscape that is untraceable, fleeting, and ever emerging. An urban landscape that symbolizes a common ground to allow for plurality to be. Thank you.
Now it's time for our interrogators, respondents.
Interrogators.
Sit over here, or?
Yeah. You can sit together or one on each side.
I'll be the only one over here.
No, we can't fraternize with.
I see. Oh, we have to. All right. You better watch out. I thought it's interesting that we. This is funny with the sound right there. We are called interrogators, actually. It gives this perception that there's some sort of crime scene that's happened, and where Bruce is the good cop, I'm the bad cop. I'm gonna drop the book on Marcelo, and he's going to bring a cup of coffee, and we're going to try to get down to who's at fault or who's responsible. But on a more serious note, it does put the question out of what are kind of the architectural or urban crimes or injustices that are out there. And I think Petra's presentation kind of led to some of these, kind of the injustice or the danger of some of these collections of information. But to think about it really on a really level of social responsibility, or thinking of on a very practical level, the kind of architectural crimes of gentrification leading toward rising or rapidly rising living price, cost of living, things such as different access to infrastructure, whether it's physical or it's information, causing social inequality, or the one that we talk about a lot is, of course, the effect of the built environment on climate change. And so what I'm wondering is, we've seen a lot of different kind of analytical ways of very scientifically investigating a topic and then coming up with some results. But I wonder, this is a question I'm always asking myself, how could we apply some of those methods to, kind of as forensic scientists, to not only uncover and reveal some of the injustices or crimes that are happening, but actually lead and try to become an agent of change in a positive direction, particularly in the context that we're professors and we're trying to teach the next generation of architects and artists to also influence those things. So it's a pretty broad question, but I'll throw that out there. Should I answer?
Well, Wiley, one of the questions about image accumulation has precisely to do with the way it fosters a potential for linking discrimination, income inequality, and access to information. We look at the current theatrical charade of fake news as evidence of this, in which you have information and you have a kind of anti-information, a dark matter out there, but the agencies purveying this are united in the possession of facts or anti-facts and dealing with the public as a grand collective of vessels waiting to be filled. I was struck too by Petra's analysis of traceable and untraceable, and in the structure of her presentation, repeating and reiterating these themes so that repetition itself became a form of accumulation. I look forward to reading it in manuscript form, because I think that device was very deliberate and about the existential core of the question this panel is dealing with. That's as good an answer as you're going to get.
I'm the bad cop, remember? He's doing a good job.
No, I think we didn't coordinate that ahead of time. I was going to be the bad cop.
Oh, so
But
I want to say something.
oh yeah, great.
Is that on? Yeah. Okay, the one thing that I keep thinking yesterday and today, is this word hack it. Like, interrupt this smartly. And I think there's a lot of architects out there these days who are doing this already quietly with the work that they're producing. And they're not necessarily saying we're hacking, but I think they're doing it. And they're changing a configuration that is trying to do its thing, and they're trying to interrupt it. So I think we as architects were doing something about it, but I think we're not necessarily saying it. And I'm thinking about Kelley Easterling right now, extra statecraft, how she talks about that actually architects could become active agents of hacking a system through design.
A comment about the apparent monolithic nature of image circulation and images and image culture. I mean, I think in the same way that the built environment can be at the service of, corporate real estate development, or at the service of housing homeless people, for instance, image circulation, image production, image culture is put to many political uses that are the entire spectrum. And so I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit of a treatment of the technology, the culture, as entirely on one side of that spectrum. And I think image culture is a basis for debate and argument and engagement that we can, engage in any number of ways. But I think that's sort of what's interesting about it. It has a power that it didn't have 10, 20 years ago, a power that is sort of in parallel to the built environment, and that we as architects can choose to engage in or not. But I think the discussion here seems to suggest that there may be opportunities for us to do so.
The presentations kept asking me to answer the question about how an archive of bricks is different than an archive of images, especially with Buzz's introduction, and how the location of where an archive exists affects how we see it and what it means. And we've heard several times over the last few days the reference to the NGA, which is the National Geospatial Imaging Center, which is about 10 miles from where we sit. Started 25 years ago in St. Louis. It's the place where satellite images are analyzed but also stored. the quantity of information over that 25 years is now approaching the collective experience of the history of every person on Earth. And the fact that that is an aspect of an archive is one that might give us pause. And so in the spirit of the bad cop, I was going to ask everyone at this given moment, why shouldn't all digital images be deleted?
It's not an immaterial question, is it? I came back from China with a computer virus that has in fact erased all the 25,000 images I had on my computer. And somehow this day has been okay. The use value of an image and the transactional value of the artifact on which it appears always differ. In the past, they did not. So the evocation of the archive that I brought up in my opening remarks is entirely specific to material archives. And the several models of archive we've talked about, I think the Corb's archive is quintessential to this, have to do with touching the paper that Corbusier touched. I think all the way back to Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, and when he writes to Charlotte, in truth, my dear, I have nothing to say. All the same, your dear hands will touch this paper. The instrumentality of touch, of physical connection, of bodies in proximity to other bodies is a nostalgia we bring to the succession of images we see on screens, all of which are emulsified in glass through electronic impulse. So all of their dissimilarity as appearances masks an absolutely consistent identity as things operating remotely from us. And this notion of the remote is inherently melancholic, hence that mention I made at the beginning. We find ourselves orbiting like the elements of some sort of vast molecule whose core is missing. And this makes other models of social use difficult to sustain in the imagination. The notion of community involves a set of cores which, while themselves are not physical, are based on relating the physicality of bodies to social spaces. Image culture, through sheer accumulation, threatens to overshadow all of these edifices of the bonds that bring us together emotionally. And so the nature of the city disappears within the construction of its various simulations. Pardon the use of a 20th century term.
And I think that has something to do with place that we're losing in this, or we maybe not even considering anymore. I think especially community, if you don't have that sense of place, I think you are not having actually community. You don't have that common ground. So, and I think that's a debate that maybe more Europeans have than Americans, I'm not sure.
So far.
Yeah, and I think we have to have discussions here in the US as well.
But I mean, this is sorry for the denial to answer questions. I mean, I apologize for myself, you know. They don't seem like, you know, I mean, they're not easy questions. I was just puzzled by your question about the deletion, you know, like, I mean, I'm surprised when we talk about digital images, like there is some other version that is not digital these days, because there really isn't, you know, that's just what we have. And so everything is digital and everything is an image, you know. Even drawings are actually images, you know, because they're not made. They're not made as they used to be. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting. I wonder if you can elaborate where were you going with that, because there's something interesting, you know. I mean, to your question, I'm still not ready to answer, but I think I think if I would to answer, I would have to sort of like maybe put forward some sort of criticism about like how, I mean, how will you see this? Because I think, I mean, architecture has always been, you know, had a complicated relationship with power and with capital. And so, you know, process of gentrifications and so on are not things that architects could control. And I, for one, believe that, sure, we're going to try and make a better world, but I could think of like 10 other jobs where I could actually have more of an effect, you know, in some of the human, political, cultural, and social conditions than being an architect. And, but I don't know if that's the kind of discussion we really need to have, you know.
Buzz and I had talked about hoping to open things up to the audience, given this amazing couple of days. And so, a wonderful comment, Marcelo, and perhaps we can see if there are responses from the group. My reference to the difference between a brick archive and a digital archive, I think, gets to my feelings about that. I think they are different. A drawing and a drawing that you said we do today. But let's open it up for comments and responses from our other presenters, as well as our own group here.
I'll carry the torch to whoever wants to light it. Just checking. Don't worry. It's hot. There's more. Don't worry.
I have a question for the FreelandBuck. I saw you adopt the patterns from classical buildings somehow. How do you see this help you when you design set plan to identify those important elements when doing design? Specifically for set plan, and then how you apply all of those patterns on them.
Can you repeat when we're designing what?
For example, urban design projects or architectural projects, when you do a site plan, when you invent drawings, how you really apply those patterns you studied to identify those elements, or somehow it's just a formal idea of doing site plan, how you apply all of those into.
I mean, maybe in relation to the last project that we spoke about, the Palo Alto project, I mean, I think that like the image in that project opened up maybe a different way to think about context, which maybe was not particularly about geometry, but thinking about how the environment as a kind of background supported an architectural idea that was about bringing a heightened sense of attention to the nature of yourself in relation to that. So by taking photographs of the surrounding context, it really wasn't so much about the patterns that came from that, but more the kind of the way that our perspective, maybe the way we capture images through a camera, which is actually different than our eyes, right? Our eyes, we have binocular vision, but a camera is monocular. And so the way that we understand depth through image is different than the way that we see it. And I think that pavilion was meant to amplify that to some degree.
So how do you see the potential that it creates space or possibilities for some spatial quantities when you apply this?
So I think we did a series of projects a little earlier in our practice that were looking at pattern as more of a spatial device, although some of the houses do that. But I think that we've been, at the time we were looking at particularly alternating patterns of solid and void or different conditions. So the house that is projected onto the three objects in the Desley gallery is one that is really about a pattern of interlocking difference, whether that's indoor or outdoor, whether that's wood and stone, whether that's light and dark. And so in that sense, I think the a graphic idea of pattern and a spatial outcome were connected. I don't think we do a lot of urban work, but maybe even earlier we did. But yeah, so I think we do think about the relationship of pattern and space. Briefly, I just want to say one other thing about the previous conversation. I feel like we're ending up in a strange place with the wrapping up the conference here. We've had 2 days of people talking about some really fascinating and potentially politically engaged and progressive, if that's a word I can still use, ways of thinking about imagery. And so to end on images are inherently an evil and we'd be better off without them, it's just kind of bizarre. I think that the group here probably doesn't spend a lot of time in online communities or image-based exchange, communities based on image exchange, but those do exist. I think that they are as much a potential generator of community as geographic locality, and so just to make that point as we wrap up here, that yeah.
But that's a good segue.
Yeah,
into
I
what
want to say
Constance
something
is
about
saying.
that. Actually, in my presentation, I wasn't actually talking about geography. I was talking about leaving images behind and who's watching them. So I think images accumulation, there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it's okay. It's just like who's capitalizing on that. That to me is actually something that I'm seeing more and more, where our images that we all post, and I'm part of it, I'm freely posting my observations of cities in Instagram. I'm happily sharing. But I'm seeing more and more and more, there's a pattern of people are watching and sending me stuff that I'm like, why are you sending me this? And somebody's watching. So for me, this is not about geography, this is about who's watching these images, who's capitalizing on that.
And place is not geographic?
Well, the place is, no, not in the way how I talk about it.
Yeah, I'm glad for the discussion and for trying to reroute a little, and I would like to add into that. It seems like the conversation turned a little to a Pandora's box suggestion, and I think that's deeply tied to nostalgia, and I think the critical position surrounding images is an important one. Your talk, Petra, made me think of invisible images. Your pictures are looking at you. I might have by Trevor Paglin. Really interesting text that's looking into all of the sort of interests involved in these massive amounts of images being collected. And I think it's a critical question for us to ask. It's really not to be overlooked, and I very much enjoyed your talk in that regard. But I think we have to think about, just for the wider, because it's not directed at you anymore, Petra, for the wider conversation, how we live in this world where these things are omnipresent, where we are fully immersed in digital environments as much as we are in a shared collective environment. That environment is pervaded by all of this material. And I think the gallery is actually a case for the materiality of these things, the fact that they are so physically present and in the same soup as everything else. So I don't know, I guess now it's turning into a statement. But I guess to reopen it to a question, I think for all of the work that we've seen, so much of it is productive, and so to sort of describe it as oppositional camps, the sort of political, some kind of real that's in opposition to the digital. How would others of you respond to this conversation that are working really closely with images, with flat projected prints, or whatever may be the case with clay based on digital imaging software? How do you see this conversation? Just because we haven't heard from everyone in response to this, I will redirect to the remaining panelists for your rebuttal as well. I did a rebuttal. That was mostly a kind of rhetorical question.
So I'm working with the physical archive of bricks. What I would add to the conversation, I think I see the merits of both, like a digital archive and the physical archive at the National Building Arts Center. They offer something very different from one another. I will say the experience of like going out to the National Building Arts Center and essentially exploring new terrain, that sort of sensory experience combined with the act of opening crates and digging through and smelling the brick and holding the brick and experiencing the material objects as something that, without getting too poetic here, was a like driving part of what like interests me in continuing to tease out and explore the project. That kind of physical connection that I think is, sort of what Buzz was really speaking to is, not something that, it's just a different experience than the digital archive. I did actually do a lot of like online research, looking at imagery of bricks online. So I see the merits of both and don't really see one as problematic necessarily.
No, it's a series of situations, and the meaning, positive or negative, is contingent on what's situated.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, Kelley, when you are using the extrusion device to make those totems, my mouth was watering because there was frosting being applied. Maybe an idiosyncratic association, but I think the mode of your documentation reveals other aspects in the history of the materials that we come upon in a culminating state. And so your work hints at the potential of data accumulation to transmogrify in a manner that parallels what Petra talks about subsequently, and how Brennan and David demonstrate a history of anamorphism as offering up something about the human condition being situated. There's a right place to look, a local reward, and yet there's no problem with stepping away from the apparent privileged position to recognize that it's only one node in a network of viewpoints. I think it's your moment, Todd.
There's a question right here. So there's an effect called the Hawthorne effect, which is about how people behave differently when they're being observed. And I'm kind of curious what your thoughts on how the way that people behave differently when they know people are watching could affect the shifting of kind of the honesty in the way that we produce images, and whether or not the understanding that we're all beginning to have that someone else is benefiting from the images that we make, someone else is seeing that we're being watched, and whether or not that knowledge is beginning to kind of change the way that we're expressing ourselves through images and kind of impact the way that what I would call like the honesty with which that we express ourselves through images.
Say one thing related to that. It's not so much about the honesty with which we make images as about how image culture changes the way that we do our jobs. So Boris Groys writes about the performativity of practicing art and by extension architecture now, in that sense that as much as we might publicize our work, we also put online our shopping lists and our Venmo payments and our all aspects of our personal lives. And so in that sense, not all, but many aspects of our personal life. And so in that sense, the work of being an artist or an architect extends beyond the discrete artifacts and how they might be photographed and distributed. It extends to the personal life of the artist, and the performance of being an artist suddenly is much broader. Not exactly your question.
And with that, I think we should conclude this panel. Thank you all. And we're going to receive closing, not closing comments, what did I call them? Interrogators' response from Todd. Thank you.